Yeah, it was really well received, which was
It should be.
it was yeah.
Ready?
Shall we? Good afternoon. Welcome to the Palazzo Sorbello. I'm John Nery. I'm an editor and columnist at the Philippine Daily Inquirer. I come from a country that is moving very quickly to normalize insanity. And I'm very happy to be here because I hope to learn some very important lessons that we can apply back home. Let me start by giving regrets. Kadar Fayyad, a Syrian activist living in Jordan, who is a civic engagement expert and who was supposed to be in our panel, unfortunately cannot join us. She was not able to get a visa in time. But I'm very happy to say that we have an excellent person, I wouldn't say filling in her shoes because she brings in her own considerable work to the table. And I will have a chance to introduce Hannah Storm properly in a bit. This is a conversation, a workshop on fighting back. What can journalists do to respond against attacks? This is my second time at the IJF, and I've noticed that this year there are media under attack is a separate category in itself. I counted, there are at least 14 sessions related to the topic, including 9 panel discussions. That's about 5% of all IJF 2018 sessions. And I think that's an indication of the kind of concern that we're facing. I just want to show, there are many ways to describe the problem. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to take a snapshot based on a UNESCO statement. So this is a new book that's out, only about 2 months old, called Defending Journalism, funded by the International Media Support Group in the Netherlands. And here you have a summary of a profession under attack, and I've expanded this. This covers the 10 years until 2016, where 827 journalists were killed, which includes over 50 journalists and media workers in the Philippines in one single incident alone in 2009. Of course, there are many other violations endured by journalists, including all sorts of online harassment. Many of these journalists who were killed were local journalists, 95% of them. And the vast majority were men, 94% of all victims. But, and I can attest to this in my capacity as an editor of an online news website, female journalists get a different, a more intense kind of online harassment. I mean, it's just terrible. And only 8% of these cases are considered resolved. So this is the situation that we're in, and this was written in 2016, and I think the situation has only become worse in the last year and a half. How worse? How much worse? Well, I'll give an example. This is a Committee to Protect Journalists Safety Advisory. Basic stuff that I think we should all know. When you cover something, make sure your battery is full, right? Basic stuff. Make sure that you go with a buddy, somebody knows where you are. Wear clothing that will allow you to run, make a quick getaway and so on and so forth. Very basic stuff. And if you meet potentially hostile people, this is what you can do. Learn to read the body language of the aggressor, maintain eye contact. Again, very basic stuff. But the reason I'm putting this up is because this was the CPJ advisory to cover the Trump inauguration, right? I mean, how much worse can it get even in Washington, D.C.? As I've mentioned, there are many other sessions tackling the topic media under attack. Many of these sessions will start with an answer like, one way of answering the question is to say we need to do our jobs better. Other people would say that the way to answer attacks against journalists is to do our jobs differently. Engage the audiences, teach news and media literacy programs, engage the platforms themselves. Another way, I think a little more, and this is where I'm coming from as a Filipino journalist, where our institutions are under attack, is a set of responses. When the integrity of the press is attacked, we need to respond. When the news is controlled, we need to respond. When press freedom is limited, we need to respond. When journalists are threatened, we need to respond. But today, our focus is on practical lessons in fighting back against online intimidation, harassment, and threats. Our first resource person is Tirana Hassan. She is the Crisis Response Director of Amnesty International. She's covered many conflict zones, and her main responsibility is she's in charge of rapid deployment of Amnesty International personnel who are sent into danger zones to document violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. And in that capacity, I think she has experience that journalists and would-be journalists can learn from. I've invited Tirana to speak first in general terms about her experience with Amnesty International. Before, in a previous reincarnation, she was a senior researcher for emergencies at Human Rights Watch. To talk about that experience and then maybe draw lessons from that experience that journalists can use. Tirana?
Thank you very much, John. So yes, it feels very odd to be a human rights organisation and a lawyer coming to speak to a room full of journalists about how to keep safe. But there are striking parallels between the challenges of security management and the sort of threats that human rights defenders face when they're at the front line of human rights challenges or telling difficult stories or the sort of documenting the sort of incidents that many people, or there's always one party that doesn't want you to tell. I just wanted to point out that Amnesty International actually does work very closely with frontline defenders, but also journalists. When we talk about human rights, it's not that there's a set of rights that is different for journalists, that there's a set of protections that sits outside the broader human rights frameworks. When there is an assault on journalists, there is an assault on freedom of expression. This makes the intersection between, I think, human rights and journalism one that is particularly acute, and it's particularly acute when it comes down to threats against journalists and news organisations. We were talking about this within the context of online security and online attacks. And I don't think that there's a lot that I could tell you that you probably don't already know. There are amazing resources out there, but the sort of things that we're facing are very similar across the board. It's, are your accounts being hacked? Are your websites under attack? Are you under personal attack as a journalist from trolls or other nefarious actors who are trying to either silence you or discredit you? What are the things that we can do to protect ourselves, and how do you fight back? Well, to be honest, it's going to be a rather disappointing answer, because the best way to fight back is to be prepared and to prevent the attacks in the first place. And, I'm not going to go through if you want to talk really practical steps, Frontline Defenders, many other organisations actually have toolkits where you can actually go and look at the sort of steps you need to take to develop strong passwords. How do you use two-factor authentication? Ensuring that when you are working on the web, that you're working in secured spaces. When you're working through encrypted messaging services like Signal, for video conferencing, what are the tools that you're using? One of the ones, our go-to ones, is obviously Jitsi. And all of these are online, and there are resources that we'd be happy to point you to if you don't have access to this already. But what I would like to talk about is how do we manage it? How do you manage risk? Because that's where the attacks come from. And I think one of the first things that we have to be really cognizant of, whether you are a manager who's in charge of a group of journalists, or whether you are a journalist yourself, it's not just you. It's the people that are driving you, it's your fixers, it's your translators. When we think about attacks and ensuring that journalists are safe and that we're going to fight back, we need to be able to ensure that we're thinking about our entire team, not just us as individuals. And of course that's different when you're a foreign correspondent working going into a conflict area, or let's say going into the Philippines to cover the war on drugs. Or you're a local journalist working for a local paper who doesn't necessarily have the budget to deploy a security team with you. So I want to walk through a couple of the different things that we sort of consider when we're Amnesty, and I'm going to share with you what happens when it all goes terribly wrong, and what you do. And if we're talking about fighting back, it's not about waiting until you're being surveilled. It's not about waiting until they cut you off in a dark alley. It's not about waiting until you've left and in the middle of the night you get a phone call and say that the people that you just interviewed on camera have been taken away by the police. If you want to fight back, whether you're a human rights defender or you're a journalist, we need to have thought about this well in advance. And the sort of things that we do in Amnesty with my team is that we have pre-deployment meetings, security meetings. And that is essentially very basic stuff, because so much of this is not rocket science. It's about sitting out and thinking about who is the team, what is the actual group of people that we will be working with, and what is the risk profile of each of those individuals. And risk profiling is something that we need to think about in terms of ourselves. If we are going in, for example, we've been covering the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, and we have a number of staff that could go in and do that. Some of us have worked on the Rohingya crisis for a long time, but somebody like me, for example, who could be perceived as looking as South Asian and has the surname Hassan, will probably raise the risk level for the rest of my colleagues, including our local translators, if I was to go. So when we actually were thinking about the deployment, we actually sent colleagues into Myanmar who would have a different risk, a different public profile, a different risk profile. It's around thinking about, your driver may not speak a word of English, but that is the person who is going to be negotiating your way through all of the checkpoints. If there are any difficult conversations to be had, if there's anybody that's going to be sort of on the radar first, and the person who will be followed up is likely to be your driver or your fixer. And we have to think about things like, who are they? And we don't often do this a lot, and we've learned the hard way from my experience as a human rights investigations, is that when something happens, your desk back at the bureau will know who to contact in an emergency. They will know how to contact your husband or your wife or your mother or your father or your emergency contact. If you've hired a driver for the day, does your bureau have the the license plate of the car that you're driving? Do they have an emergency contact for your driver? Because we do work a lot of the time on with daily help. So imagine, it's really going down into the nitty-gritty, because if you are going to fight back if something goes terribly wrong, for example, one of the things in terms of digital harassment and online harassment that has happened in Myanmar was that they started taking photographs of journalists who were up in a place called Sitwe, which was as close to where the violence against the Rohingya, or between the Rohingya and the security forces, had actually taken place. And that was a place that journalists could move around. It was very far from where the action was, but people could move around there, except all of a sudden Twitter was awash with the photographs of the journalists who were up there, with photographs of their passport details, with whatever personal information they could get online. How do you fight back when you're on the ground in a resource-poor environment, so you're not particularly connected, but all of these threats are happening in real time and they're happening to your family as well? It's like the best thing to do is to have planned for that. But you also need to be able to have people on the back end who are able to take the steps to warn the people that might be exposed as a result of you being there, that they need to take steps to be able to manage their security. And then you think about what's going to happen if you're being photographed and you're in a car, your driver's face is being exposed, your translator's face is being exposed. So thinking about all of that and being prepared for it and taking the mitigating actions. And that's essentially the smartest way that we can do that, is by ensuring that we're thinking ahead, risk profiling ourselves and anybody who's on our team, and taking mitigating factors, sort of mitigating steps to ensure that we're doing everything in our power to ensure that we're not putting people at increased risks and we're managing the risks that we do have. In terms of, when it goes terribly wrong, there's been a couple of occasions for me where it has gone wrong that I have witnessed. So what are the situations where it goes wrong? Of course, the one that we think about the most is that somebody is stopped or killed. Unfortunately, there are way too many examples of that in recent times. But I think one of the times that we've seen, to be honest, if I look back at the last few years, where it goes really wrong is when we just think that the online harassment, that the stalking, that the threats, that these sort of passive, these continually hyper-aggressive but passive attacks are just something that we can wash off. They're not. And what happens when it goes terribly wrong is not necessarily that someone's going to lose their lives, it's the fact that we lose good people from our profession. Because the consequences of these sort of attacks are things like people being silenced, it's the emotional, it's fear, it's the self-censorship, it's the worry about, am I putting my friends and my family at risk? And time again now, we have seen human rights defenders and journalists who have left the profession. We focus on the many brave few who stick it out, but there are plenty who just can't cope. And that's where I think for those of us who manage teams of journalists, this is our responsibility. It is our responsibility to know what the impact of online harassment is. It's our responsibility to be asking. It's our responsibility not only to be asking about what's the content of the violent sort of threats that you're getting, show us the threats of rape, show us the horrible pictures. It's about what we do with that information. And for me, that is one of the first indicators that we need to review our security protocol. It is not that we're about to launch an attack and call Facebook and Twitter and report all of these people, which we should, that's part of it. But it's about saying, as a manager, I need to now sit down with the person who is experiencing this, and it is my responsibility to fight to ensure that they are safe and secure. And the first thing we do is looking at, all right, what is their what is the emotional impact of this? And destroying that sort of culture that we have that says that this is all meant to be water off a duck's back. This is just part and parcel of being on the front line. It's actually about saying, no, this is not normal. This is incredibly frightening, and it does have a social impact, and we need to demystify the idea that we're all tough as nails. And I think that journalism and the sort of work that we do in human rights work suffers from a really dangerous problem, and that is sort of we don't like to show weakness. Being vulnerable or being impacted by threats and having your security compromised is somehow, it doesn't line up with the idea of being on the front line, getting through anything to get the story. So we need to demystify that. And if we really want to fight back, we have to change the culture in which we talk about security and talk about risk thresholds. And so that's one thing as a manager that I believe we have to do. The other thing I think that we all have to do is, I was talking about using these sort of online threats as indicators. There are actually things that, there are services that exist that we have used for some of our most high risk category researchers. Not at Amnesty, but in other organisations I've worked for, which actually monitor the internet and monitor social media and look for threats that we might not be seeing, not necessarily the ones that are sent on Twitter, but it's the articles that are being written about these people. And you get, now this costs money, so this is really only for the sorts of organisations that have the resources, but there are other ways to do it, of ensuring that you're constantly looking for articles being written about your staff or yourself. Looking for non-traditional chat boards or online publications that aren't necessarily the audience that we engage with, but it's where sometimes the most dangerous conversations are happening. So when you are aware that those conversations are happening, then you can take the sort of steps that are required to mitigate risks for your staff. And the reality is, when I talk about mitigating risk, they're really practical things that you have to do. Can you pull someone from a story for a while? And that has to be negotiated with the person. But in the worst circumstances, we've actually had to have people leave the country. And I'm going to leave it to Hannah to talk about the sort of supports that you get in the journalism world, but within certainly the human rights world, and certainly at Amnesty, we have a defenders fund. We have a pool of money which, when it comes to a real crisis point, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's just a death threat, it actually can also mean that this person is at breaking point. One more threat of being raped or beheaded, one more photograph that shows them being attacked or shot could be enough to put them over the edge. And so we have actually taken steps in some instances where we've actually had people come out of countries to have a reprieve. And that's a concrete step. That is fighting back, because you are keeping good journalists safe. You are keeping good human rights defenders in the game to fight for another day. I think that the idea that you're able to do that, it goes very bad when those people can't go back. And you have to think through all of those things before you develop very extreme steps, like somebody saying, we're going to pull you out of the country for 6 weeks, because you need to be ensuring that they can actually go back, or you need to be ensuring at least that you're prepared for the fact that what happens if they can't go back? What happens to their families? What happens to their security? What happens to a refugee application? And that's what I'll just talk about when it goes bad. And this goes down to, it taps on a number of issues. Just quickly, I was working in a country in West Africa, and we were doing an investigation into abuses by security forces. During this investigation, we came across a piece of video which actually showed an attack where the security forces had killed a number of people, and the video purportedly had a number of dead bodies with the security forces, shot by the security forces, and it was security force video. Obviously very incriminating stuff. The video, we didn't, the video was given to us. This was not when I was at Amnesty International, but we went along our way. We had this video. We were going to get it checked and verified, and we left the country. When we left the country, our translator, who had also been our driver, it was about a week later, was driving across the country to go and visit family and was routinely stopped. And all of their USB sticks and all of it, their laptop, their telephone was all taken. Because at some point in time, there had been a breakdown in our security protocol. Somewhere along the line, either there had been human intelligence which had been listening to us when we had been speaking in a semi-private place, or one of the phones had been compromised. And somehow they had the understanding that we had the potential to get our hands on this video. Now, what happened then was so this goes to the point that if you're going to prepare, if you want to fight back, if you want to be secure, you need to think about every little thing, including the way you communicate when you're in a country. So what do you have on your mobile phone? Because the thing that became the most threatening to our fixer and translator was the fact that every piece of correspondence with us, even though he had nothing to do with the investigation, was on his phone. Wow. So when you leave a country, are you thinking about what is there? The end of this story, it's about thinking through everything, basically. And when we left, we should have taken every USB key, we should have taken every hard drive, we should have made sure that his hard drives were clear of any correspondence with us. And we don't, and you don't think about it until it's too late. And so my plea, I guess, as journalists is to not just think about fighting back about your own safety, think about it as your team, think about the details. Because once you move into a space where the incident's happening, all you can do is try and fix it. The end result of this story was that this person was detained at home for months on end. Eventually, he was able to leave the country, but he left behind his wife and his 2 children. And he got refugee status. And that's because we supported that application, and he's in a 3rd country now where he is safe. And he can be reunited with his family. But when we talk about protection, I just say that we need to talk about details. You need to think about every step of the way, and the best way to fight back is to actually mitigate risk. And I'll hand over to Hannah.
Before we call on Hannah, I have a quick question for Tirana. Does Amnesty International use a security checklist? And is that something that you can share with others?
We have our own sort of security protocols. So we have a risk assessment system where we go through, and it has to be done. So that goes through background of where you're about to work. Then you go through what the actual research is. Then you go through risk profiling of your team and the individuals who are going. And then you basically list down every single risk that might be possible. And then that needs to be measured as being low, medium, or high. And then you actually need to take steps and look at what is the mitigating factor, what is the mitigating action. And the reality is that is not a checklist. And I'm actually a bit concerned about checklists because otherwise, both myself as when I was doing field deployments, and now as somebody who managed it, you go, yeah, done, check, 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 check. And that's not the point, because at that point, when we look at that risk assessment, it's not saying, okay, you're ready to go. It's actually reading the mitigating factors and saying, I'm sorry, that's just not enough. It crosses the risk threshold of the organization, and this mission is not possible. And I'll be very honest with you, for me, that one is kidnap. I mean, there are many things that you can't mitigate, kidnap is one of them. So there are security checklists, and I'm probably not the best person to sort of hand you the Amnesty one, but there are a number of checklists and steps, I think, that probably somebody like Hannah's better placed to talk about.
Thank you, Tirana. I'm very pleased to have Hannah Storm join us this afternoon on very short notice. Hannah was a journalist for more than a decade, and now she's responsible for the safety of other journalists. She's the director of the International News Safety Institute. And as the name implies, they are responsible for providing safety advice and training to many, very many journalists. And sometimes they work with established organizations like the BBC and Reuters and other such major organizations. She's also the co-author of The Kidnapping of Journalists, Reporting from High-Risk Conflict Zones, as well as No Woman's Land, on the front lines with female reporters. I think she's in an excellent position to guide us through our topic today. Hannah?
Thank you. And apologies if I've been scribbling notes desperately and checking my emails to try and get some practical information for you. As John mentioned, I've been running INSI, or the International News Safety Institute, for the last, I've been there for 8 years. I've been running it for about the last 4 years. I just want to give you a quick sense of how things have changed in the last 8 years, and then I specifically want to talk today more about online harassment and how we can help support journalists to mitigate the risks, but also, as we say, fight back as well. I would just start by saying I corroborate everything that Tirana has said. It's about almost like, if you want to use the phrase fighting forwards rather than fighting back. It's about thinking about things in advance. It's about a risk assessment. And I also, what you're saying about this checklist is really important. It's about having a risk assessment, but also about having a conversation, and a conversation based on trust that includes all members of a team. And it's a constantly changing and evolving conversation that does not resort in a box-ticking exercise, because that's where we're in danger. So just briefly, I mean, when I joined INSI and I was a journalist overseas for numerous years, one of the biggest risks in terms of safety was that traditional kind of old adage of the kind of, and it was usually the middle-aged white man, veteran foreign correspondent going into a war zone, yeah? And he had his flak jacket, and he had his kit, and he had his HEFAT training, which cost thousands and thousands of pounds, and he was all very good, thank you very much. And also there was this concept of, when I was working with organisations, how do we help support the poor local journalist, in inverted commas, which was generally an afterthought, right? So it was pretty much a kind of awkward conversation where it was a them and us type scenario. And that, for me, means there's already a massive power imbalance. And it was something that over the past few years we've worked really hard to try to change. Now, nowadays we provide less training, as in on-the-ground, boots-on-the-ground training, because we know there are safety providers out there that do that. What we work really hard to do is to work with our members, as John mentioned, BBC, CNN, EBU, AP, Reuters, Al Jazeera, are all members of ours, and we coordinate conversations around safety. So if a team is sending somebody into X country, how do we help support them? If they're looking to how to understand the current laws around encryption in a certain country, how do we support them? They're effectively giving me pieces of the jigsaw where I can put the jigsaw together and then feed back the information. That good practice then helps support journalists who are in more vulnerable situations. You know, the traditional, and I hate the phrase local journalists, but those traditional journalists who always bear the brunt of the real insecurity. So just to give you a couple of figures now, just before I move on to kind of how things are changing. In 2016, so INSI records the deaths of media workers. So what Tirana said before about your whole members of the team, every single person in that media team is crucially important to getting the story right. So often the media workers, the drivers, the translators, the fixers have not been given the justice and the kind of, you know, tribute, I suppose, that they need. The kind of so in the unfortunate situation where people are killed, we mark and we recognise those media workers as well. So in 2016, for example, 115 journalists and media workers were killed, according to our records. Last year, interestingly, 68. So just slightly over half of that were killed. The reason I'm going to mention this is the reason I mention this is that John was speaking before about the changing threats to women journalists. If you look at the figures from 2016, of the 115 who were killed, 112 were male. If you look at the figures from last year, of the 68 who were killed, 9 were female. So 57, can I do my maths? 59. No, I've got the maths wrong, sorry. Start again. 68 people were killed last year, 9 were female. That is the highest percentage of women journalists killed in any year I know, okay? Any year since I started INSEE. So for me, that means that the balance and the shifts are changing. And the reason I wanted to set that up is that when I joined INSEE, we were talking about something that was quite traditional safety. In some ways, it was easier to mitigate against because you're talking about war zones. People are going into war zones. They've got the flak jacket and they've got their, risk assessment. They've got their communication strategy. We've got their next of kin. Nowadays, the front lines are changing. They're really changing. And nowadays, the front lines are not just about war zones. They're about domestic terror threats. They're about online harassment. And that brings me, not in a very natural segue, so I apologise, onto online harassment. One of the most insidious issues we are dealing with at INSEE in terms of our members is online harassment. And that's particularly, specifically gendered online harassment. That we know from research and we know from anecdotal conversations I've been having that women are much more likely. I think there was a Demos report that women are 3 times more likely to receive online harassment than men. So I just want to talk about that for a couple of minutes now, because how we are working with journalists to try to understand that, some of the threats they face and some of the response mechanisms that are in place as well. All of that caveated with whether you go to a war zone that's a physical conflict or whether you're in a digital war zone, all of that needs to be understood and assessed in advance, as Tirana was saying. So at INSEE, we are having conversations with the platforms and with the news organisations, because I do not believe you can have a conversation about how to combat something happening online unless you include all members of the conversation. That's my personal and professional opinion. So you need to engage Twitter, you need to engage Facebook, and you need to engage news organisations. We're having conversations around that. One of my worries is, anecdotally, when I speak to female journalists, and male journalists as well, but female journalists and also members of LGBTQ communities specifically as well, is that we're now in a situation where people think it's just part of the job, right? You put your name out there, you have a Twitter handle, you have a Facebook page, you have an Instagram account, you're on YouTube, it's part of your job. You just suck it up, buttercup, And actually, no, as Tirana says, we don't have to accept it. And as a journalist, we're very good at putting on that emotional kind of armour, right? Of saying, it's okay, I'm okay, until we receive some God Almighty crash. So I did a panel this morning on trauma, and again, one of our colleagues said, look, we're not very good at giving ourselves permission to say, I don't feel good about this. This crosses over into the online landscape. So when I speak to journalists and they say to me, it's not that bad, the abuse I'm getting. I mean, I've only received rape threats online. And I go, well, hang on a second, you've only received rape threats online? And they're like, well, yeah, but it's not in the real world, is it? Or one of my colleagues says to me, well, my colleague received a threat of death, and I only received a threat of somebody knowing where I live and know which school my child goes to. I'm like, hang on a second. So we're normalizing the experience, right? We're saying that actually just because it happens in this virtual landscape, it doesn't mean it happens in real life. So one of the concerns, and this points back to what Tirana was saying, is that how do we, as journalists and a journalistic community and a news community, separate what a dear friend of mine called Mark Little, who's on this festival circuit at the moment, always calls, how do we separate the noise, the news from the noise, okay? So how do we separate the threat from all of the kind of sounds of, maybe it's a threat, maybe it's not a threat? How do we distinguish what really is an issue that is going to cause people problems? So that's one of my big concerns. So just very, very briefly, a lot of news organisations nowadays, when they have talent or journalists coming in, they work quite hard with them to help them understand in advance what their social media profile looks like. Okay, so they'll effectively do a bit of a a risk assessment of their social media profile. And that includes everything from, what images are you putting on Twitter, what's your geolocator system like, what images of other people are you putting on Facebook and Twitter, do you separate your personal from your public, do you separate your professional from your private, are you on pages, where are you elsewhere, what are your security settings? So they'll effectively do an overview, and then that in itself is some kind of pretty good risk assessment. So as you mentioned before about risk assessments, there are templates in place that can be provided, but I would caution against that whole checklist mentality. What I just want to do briefly now is I want to just talk about 5 pieces of advice that a colleague of mine who is just brilliant in this area, her name is Mary Hamilton. She was the former executive editor of audience at The Guardian. She now works at the BBC. She doesn't know that I'm stealing her advice because it's too late. If sharing that I'm promoting and offering her brilliant expertise and work in this setting. She was at an event with me in News Exchange, which is a broadcast media conference in November, where she and 2 other brilliant female journalists talked about their experiences. And I'm just going to pull up my email because I was copying and pasting it as Tirana was talking. And I just want to run you through this advice, because if you are an individual or a news management organisation or a news organisation or a union, it's good advice, right? 2 things I'd say before I mention that: individuals and teams both need to take responsibility. The responsibility ultimately lies with an individual, even if you're working within a team as well. So, she says, wondering where the heck it is. Right, okay, 5 pieces of advice. Anticipate campaigns of abuse that targets the journalist, the organisation, and the entire concept of reporting. Okay? So anticipating campaigns of abuse. So this is before it happens. Second piece of advice, again, underscoring what Tirana has said, prepare for the worst attacks before they happen. Yeah? Third piece of advice, and this to me is really key, because this speaks to the systemic issues that are still underpinning some of the harassment. Okay? Commission diverse writers on diverse topics to mitigate their personal risks. So we know, for instance, that if a queer woman of colour, for instance, is talking about issues around the LGBT community or, specific issues around race, she's more likely to be targeted. We know that. But if we give her a different kind of audience to talk to, or we commission her to write different kinds of stories, perhaps we help offset that risk profile, yeah? So diverse people on diverse topics. And again, as Tirana was saying before, if you need to move people away from topics, much as if you need to move people away from countries, you need to be able to consider doing that as well. Designing your systems and tools to minimize harassment and harm. So that means systems such as message systems and things like that, people's ability to respond and people's ability to monitor and measure. And the 5th one, which to me is the most crucial one, is addressing this starts from the very top. It's no good for a junior journalist to be burying her head in the sand and thinking, oh my God, I'm about to quit as a journalist, if the person at the top doesn't understand that. And there are systemic issues there, because predominantly people in newsrooms at the higher echelons are male. It doesn't mean that they are the enemy, but it does mean that the conversation needs to take place. So it starts from the very top, it goes through line managers, and it affects the entire organisation, no exceptions. I will finish by just talking briefly about my biggest concern, because I appreciate I've been talking for a long time. My biggest concern is that, women journalists are being forced to shut up. Women journalists are self-censoring. Women journalists are leaving, in some instances, profession, and young, potentially brilliant women journalists are no longer entering the profession because they are scared that if they raise their head above the parapet and they shout out, they are going to be shot down. So this is a new war zone in many ways, right? And unless we have this diversity of voices, we can't reflect society. So if somebody says to me as a journalist, don't feed the trolls, I understand that as a piece of advice, I understand that, but it's also saying to somebody who's received abuse, telling them that they're going to have their tongue ripped out, that they're going to be raped until they die, they're basically being told to be quiet again, that it's your fault. So I have an issue with being told not to shut up, to put up or shut up, because it's effectively turning the kind of blame is being thrust back on the person who is receiving the abuse, rather than looking at how we combat that as a system and as an industry. I will stop there. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you, Hannah. We're going to spend the last 15 minutes for questions. I just have one quick question for Hannah. What do you tell journalists, especially women journalists, how should they respond to comments like those? Like, so they publish an article, and the first comment is from a guy saying, "I want to rip your tongue out."
So it's really difficult. Is the first thing I'd say is there is no one-size-fits-all approach to advice. Everybody's experience is different because everybody's background is different, everybody's profile is different. What I would say, first of all, that's absolutely key is we need more of a sense of solidarity within our industry to call out these abuses. It's no good one person shouting into the dark to say, this absolute bastard, excuse my language, said that they wanted to rape me to death. I mean, yes, it's great that that person feels brave enough to come forward, but we need more of a sense of solidarity around that. And again, it's, we're working hard at INSEE on trying to develop a set of tips and advice and tools. I would say that I am also on the board of something called Trollbusters, if anybody's heard of them. They're a US-based brilliant organisation. We were here on a panel last year when I was invited to join the board, but they're doing some great work. So there is an industry movement to try to combat this. It's taking time, but I'd say to the women, you're not alone. Don't feel like you're shouting into the dark by yourself. That's the key thing.
Thank you. Let's have questions, please. Questions or suggestions from the floor? Yes, please. Let's hold on for the mic. They're documenting the entire session, all sessions.
I'm sorry, I didn't realise I had a mic on the way. I wondered what you thought about the social networks, the social platforms, so sort of Facebook, Twitter, and the role they play or the role they should play in helping to prevent and combat this abuse. For example, the reporting tools that we have on Facebook and Twitter. In your collective experience, are these adequate? And are there ways that sort of journalists can, really get the most out of what seems to me, a limited tool set?
Can you tell us who you are? Sorry.
Yes, I'm Karen Fleeting from Trinity Mirror.
Yes, please.
Do you want me to respond to that?
Both of you, please.
So we've been working for the last 3 months trying to bring, last 2 years for me, but more concretely over the last 3 to 6 months, bringing together people in a room. So Facebook, Twitter, and news organisations together in a closed room where people feel comfortable talking about this. So we're talking about what's being done, and we're talking about where the gaps are. So, specifically, are there issues around how do we triage a system? How do we understand what the real, as when I said before, the news from the noise? How do we understand if it's a real proper, it's going to escalate threat? Is there a situation where perhaps journalists may need to effectively have I guess like a press badge, yeah? Is that situation in place? I think that some of the tools out there that Facebook and Twitter are using are good. I think there's a lack of understanding in some areas about what is out there, if that makes sense. And I also think that it's not helped necessarily by this sense of, this very still much a sense of them and us. I appreciate that Facebook recognises it's done wrong. But it also has a journalism safety project in place, I think, that's trying to help support journalists. Not always entirely kind of perfectly, but nothing's perfect at the moment. So the conversation's taking place, number one. If you guys would like to become part of the conversation at Trinity Mirror, we'd love you to. If you've got suggestions and ideas, great. There is good practice being shared. So a number of organisations have got bits and bobs of work that they're doing. So we're trying to pull that all together to try and then share back out to those most vulnerable communities what good practice looks like.
Thank you. Tirana, would you like to say something about platforms too?
I would just say that I think that there's a lot that can be done sort of at the policy level, and that comes through engagement. At Amnesty, we've just done a big report called Toxic Twitter, where we looked at online harassment of journalists, of female politicians, and human rights defenders, and other sort of people, women with public profiles, and looked at sort of how the sort of online abuse, and have been documenting that, and we're using that as an evidence base to be able to move forward with social media platforms, to be able to talk about, to give them a better understanding of the types of abuse, and then to start talking through what's the best way to respond, how can you make these forums safer, but also what's the way to respond. So I think there are two different questions there, but it has to happen in conversation.
Can I just mention one more point? A lot of the abuse begins in the dark web, right? So a lot of the kind of conversations around trolling and the vitriol attacks begin and almost become viral before we're even able to determine that they exist, unless we've got ways of infiltrating the dark web, or they exist in closed or secret groups on some of the platforms. So there's a conversation to be had there about how do we manage that as well, I think, and that's really important too.
Thank you. Another question or suggestion from the floor? Hannah and Tirana asked me to say a little something about the situation of Maria Ressa and Rappler in the Philippines. They've come under direct attack from our president. They've been fielding online harassment since before the elections in May 2016. In Maria's case, for instance, there's a certain point where she received rape threats at the rate, I forget now the rate, I think that's like 1 every 5 minutes for several hours. It was obviously an orchestrated campaign, and then the second wave of the campaign was to say, I wouldn't even rape her. That was it was really just a terrible thing. And it started from within the armed services, and it took the chief of the head of the military to say, stop this. I mean, this is not who we are. For that to happen. I don't know if Maria was able to bring that up, because that happened on Facebook and with Mark Zuckerberg when they had a chance to talk. But I do remember what she has a story about meeting Mark Zuckerberg, and she says, in the Philippines we have 50% internet penetration rate, but of the 50% of the Filipinos, so like 50 million Filipinos are on the internet, 93% are on Facebook. And Mark Zuckerberg's answer was, what happened to the 7%? So this total world domination mindset, I don't know if he still has that, but I think that partly explains why we really need to engage Facebook. We do. I mean, as in our individual capacities and also representing our organizations, and now as a network of journalists, we do engage with Facebook.
So it was 90 hate messages an hour she received at the height of the abuse that she countered. There's a fantastic article by a friend of mine called Julie Passetti, who's an Australian academic, and she wrote it in June last year, and I've just got it in front of me. It's called Fighting Back Against Prolific Online Harassment in the Philippines. One of the brilliant things that Maria Ressa did was that she engaged the community, so the people she speaks with, the audience she speaks with, and she engaged them to help her understand who it was who was targeting her. Yeah, so they found out the specific person who was behind some of the most vitriolic abuse. Mm-hmm. And secondly, she was getting harassment from, I think it was the armed forces, a general in the armed forces at one stage. And because of the pressure from the conversation that she began, she had with her networks, she actually got an apology, a public apology, because she was able to work with her networks and a conversation in the audience. So she is just, if you want an example of somebody who's got some really great practical advice and steps, and just a fantastically brave woman, I would point you towards, just do a bit of a Google search on some of the things that she's done. So Maria Ressa is Ressa.
And she's here.
She's here.
She has a talk
she's
this
very
afternoon.
busy. Yeah. She's very, very busy, because I've been trying to sit with her for the last 3 days. Yeah, she is here though.
Thanks. We have a few more minutes. Do you have other questions? Yes, please.
So I just had a question about one of the final comments made about how sort of saying "don't feed the trolls" also means, you know, be quiet, shut up and sit down. And are you saying that this is bad advice? Because this is the advice that we sort of commonly give to our journalists. You know, just, you know, don't engage. Just, you know, sit back.
I'm not saying it's bad advice. I don't think it's the end all. I don't think there's a one size fits all approach to this. And I don't think we should be giving that advice all the time. I understand why people are giving it, because becomes a feeding frenzy, right? So you don't want to feed the trolls in some instances. There are other instances where you can give that advice but help somebody understand that in giving that advice, that is not a designation of blame against you, because one of the ways gender-based abuse works is that it undermines a woman's ability to take control. And if you're saying don't feed, you're saying shut up, and you're hitting the woman where it hurts. So it can be given, but with that cultural and sensitive notion of the reason we're telling you this is this, but it might not always be the right advice. Mary Beard, for instance, in the UK, who actively engaged and had civil conversations. Sometimes it's possible to have a civil conversation with somebody and say, would you say that to your mum or your sister or your daughter? And sometimes people will engage more positively in that manner. Maybe not, but maybe they will. So yes, and it's the advice a lot of media organisations give. So maybe it's right, or maybe it's malleable.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Tirana. I'd like to thank the audience for making time for this. I think we learned quite a bit today. The two takeaways for me: Tirana's point about online harassment, it does not wash off. I mean, it has a real impact on us, even if it's quote-unquote only online. And I really like the way Hannah reframed the entire conversation. Instead of just merely fighting back, we should fight forward. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you. My hand's very cold, sorry. It's really cold in here. Yeah.
To be here because